The noise of the brickyard carried long before first light, a chain slapping a post, a mold thumped out of clay, the short bark of an order answered by the scrape of a shovel. In the delta air, damp and gritty, men moved in lines between pits and drying racks. Torches marked the perimeter with yellow cones. An Egyptian taskmaster walked the aisles with a staff in one hand and a rope in the other, eyes fixed on the pace of the work. When a laborer staggered under a load of wet brick, the staff cracked across his back and the rope followed. The man cried out. No one looked up. In this yard, looking up could mean the next blow was yours. On the edge of the yard, a man stood in the shadow of a kiln wall and watched. He wore linen better than a laborer's, finer weave, cleaner hem, but dust had found him anyway, clinging to his arms and face. He had grown up in Pharaoh's house. He knew courts and corridors, the weight of gold rings, the way servants moved when a prince entered a room. Yet he had been told since he could remember that he was born to a Hebrew mother and drawn from the river as a child. His name reflected that day. Now, older and strong, he had come out to his people, as he would later explain, to see with his own eyes how they lived. He took in the yard the way a soldier studies ground, where the gates were, where the overseers stood in pairs, where the watchtower cut the sky. The Hebrews moved as if tightly bound to the rhythm of the task. Tread the clay with straw, fill the mold, strike it level, turn the bricks, carry, stack. The overseer shouting at the staggering laborer did not stop. He took a grip on the back of the man's neck and drove him forward until they both slid on wet clay. The laborer fell. The staff rose again. The watcher stepped out from the wall. He stood fully in the lane now, close enough to see the welt already rising on the laborer's shoulder. The overseer saw him and hesitated, then recognized the cut of the linen and the carriage of someone used to being obeyed. He let the staff drop to his side, but kept hold of the laborer's neck. The yard quieted by degrees, as sound does when fear crosses it, men working with their hands while their ears strained. The man from the court looked left and right. He saw no officer close enough to intervene, and no witness he trusted who would tell this story straight. He looked back at the overseer. "Leave him," he said. The overseer made a show of a smile that did not reach his eyes. "He is lazy," he said. "They are all lazy." "If I turn my head—" The staff rose again in his hand. What happened next was not long. The man from the court moved fast, faster than the overseer expected from someone dressed that way. He closed the distance in 2 steps, struck the staff aside, and drove his shoulder into the overseer's chest. They went down in the clay together. The Hebrew laborer rolled clear and crawled toward the drying racks, coughing. The overseer swung the rope like a flail and found only air. The man from the court pinned the overseer's wrist, reached for a fist-sized stone at the edge of the pit, and brought it down. The strikes were not wild. They were aimed. The overseer's head turned once, then his body stopped moving. For a moment, everything in the yard took on the strange quiet that comes when men try to decide what they have just seen. The laborers nearest the scene looked at the ground. One pushed his mold forward with shaking hands. The man from the court stood, chest heaving, and looked again left and right. He found the rising ground beyond the racks, a strip of sand cut by scrub. He lifted the dead overseer by the shoulders and dragged him there. He kicked at the sand with the heel of his sandal and pulled it down over the face. He worked until the shape lay smooth and the marks of his heels disappeared under the new layer. Then he turned and left the yard by a different lane than the one he had entered. The next day, he went out again. If he intended to see whether his act had traveled through the camp, he did not say. He found 2 Hebrews in a narrow lane, fists up, faces red with the kind of fury that forgets itself in proximity. He stepped between them and put his hands on their chests to push them apart. "Why do you strike your companion?" he asked the one with the clenched jaw. The man's eyes slid past him and then fixed full on his face. "Who made you a prince and judge over us?" the man said. "Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The words landed like a thrown brick. The man from the court felt the ground shift under him. He had looked left and right yesterday and thought the lane empty. Someone had seen. If a Hebrew had seen, an Egyptian could have seen. If an Egyptian told the wrong ear in the palace, there would be no time to explain motive or restraint. There would be the simple fact of a dead overseer and a man of the court found at the scene with clay on his hands. He did not sleep in his own bed that night. Word moved faster than carts in cities, and it moved fastest toward the seat of power. Pharaoh was told that a man raised in his house had killed a taskmaster. Old loyalty made no difference. The charge was grave, the deliberate killing of a royal servant by someone who had eaten royal food. Orders went out to arrest him. He had already gone. He chose desert because desert gives no easy path to a pursuer who is not determined. He took the road east, where the mud of the delta hardens to gravel, past wells where men looked at his linen and then at his empty hands and learned at speed the list of ways a city man must adapt if he means to live, how to judge the depth of a skin by a shake, how to walk with the sun at his back to keep from burning his face, how to count the last few dates in a pouch like a miser with coin. Far from the place where bricks were molded and stacked, he came to a well in Midian. The shade fell short. The waterline was low. He sat and let his heart slow under the weight of the last 2 days. Shepherds arrived first, men used to taking water without hurry or courtesy. They drove their flocks ahead of them and found a group of young women already there with skins and ropes. The women were daughters of a local priest known as Roel. They had come to draw for their father's animals and found the pattern the same as other days. Those with no swords waited while those with swords drank. The man from the court saw what was about to happen and stood. He had learned in a city that sometimes the only way to make room at a well is to move bodies with your hands. He stepped in front of the women. When the shepherds reached for their ropes, he took hold of one by the forearm and twisted it back until the man made a sound that suggested he could hear bone. He put his back to the well mouth and kept it there. A staff swung. He ducked it. He pushed. When it was done, no blood lay on the sand. The shepherds backed off to curse and spit. The women hauled their skins up without looking at him, and then looked at him and could not decide whether to thank him or fear him. He said nothing that they could not have said to one another. That evening, at their father's table, the story came out fast. "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds," one said, naming him by his clothing and his accent. Reuel asked the question any father with sense would ask. "Where is he?" "Why did you leave the man?" "Call him, that he may eat bread." The invitation was simple. The man accepted it because a chair is a gift when a man has had 2 days without one. He washed his hands until the clay left his nails. He did not speak first. What followed in Midian did not make the scribes' lists beyond a few lines, but it turned a fugitive into a man with ties. Reuel gave him shelter. Then he gave him work. Then he gave him a daughter, Zipporah, in marriage. In time, she bore a son. The man named the boy Gershom and said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land," which meant both that he now had a tent where he could put the boy to sleep and that he did not pretend the desert had adopted him as one of its own. Back in Egypt, the king who had signed the order for the man's arrest died. Another took his place. The Hebrews groaned under forced labor. Their cry carried low at first, and then with a tone that could not be ignored by anyone who had a stake in keeping the workforce productive. The stories they told at night were old, an oath sworn to their fathers, a land promised far away. The record keeps that part short, Words like remembered and looked and knew. But every word sits on countless days of brick and straw, on wrists rubbed raw by ropes, on backs still wearing the map of an overseer's staff. The city moved as if it had always been that way. Years passed in Midian measured by seasons on the hills and the length of pasture. The man who had run from the brickyard learned sheep the way he had learned halls and corridors as a boy. He learned which footing a ewe trusted on a scree slope and which angle into the wind kept a flock facing the right way. The desert turned a man who had once moved between carved columns into a man who could tell the time by a shadow on a rock. When he thought about Egypt, it was usually at night when the sand kept heat and the sheep were quiet. In those moments, the overseer's face came back, not as an abstract judgment, but as a memory of color and breath and the feel of a stone in the hand. He knew exactly what he had intended and exactly what it had cost. What happened later, the bush that burned and was not consumed, the voice that called his name twice, the command to go back, the name spoken from within flame, the staff turned sign, belongs to another episode. What matters for this one is what lay behind that moment. Before he could speak for a people, he had learned what it was to act for one man and to pay for it with the only coin available then, leaving. He had defended a stranger at a well without killing and learned the difference between stopping a wrong and making a corpse. He had taken a wife and named a son with a word that meant guest, a word that fit his life so well he could not say whether it would ever stop fitting. If you look at the yard where bricks once dried in the sun, you can still trace the lane where the overseer walked and the narrow strip of sand where hurried hands raked a body out of sight. If you stand at the well in a far country, you can still see how a single man's decision can make room for others to draw water. The facts do not need decorating. A man raised in a palace killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew. He hid the body in the sand. He was recognized for what he had done when he tried to settle a fight the next day. He ran. He defended women at a well. He lived as a foreigner, married, and had a son. Meanwhile, Egypt groaned under labor, and the cries from the brickyards rose high enough that even a man in the desert could feel the pull of them. The first act that put him on the path was both judgment and crime. It was a blow meant to end a beating. It ended a life. Nothing that came later erased that. It did, however, force a man to learn the weight of acting with his hands in a world where law belonged to the powerful and mercy could be a rumor. The record keeps his name and the order of events. The ground where it happened keeps the rest. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.